one of the things I've been doing is writing a play. And this has been very interesting for me because it's a completely different way of approaching material and literature. And I actually wrote this with a colleague who's an English professor. And the way it worked is we were teaching a class together which was on mathematics and literature. And then we wrote a series of essays about it. And then we were invited to give a talk. And now this professor, she's actually a drama person. She works at the Folger Theater in Washington, D.C. So I said, why don't we surprise these people that we're going to give a talk to, write a play, and then just read it out there. So we actually wrote this play, and sure enough, about 10 days before we were supposed to go to Canada, this thing was in Canada, we said, could you give us 2 actors as well? We'll play 2 of the roles, and then we'll need 2 actors in addition. So we went there and we just rehearsed for about 3 or 4 hours, and we did it. And that's the first time I've actually acted. And it was pretty good. I mean, in the sense that the audience really liked it. So then when we came back to our university, we got a proper director, we got proper actors, and we started practicing. And we actually did the play twice at our university. And the one thing that I wasn't prepared for was just the amount of time it takes to practice. Rehearse all the lines and all. Just took hours and hours. And I was just wondering why we are doing this. Why am I doing this? I'm mathematics and fiction and all playwriting. But to be able to play a mathematician, that was actually kind of nice. And I couldn't get into Bollywood, so this is what I ended up with, doing this one play. So the play is about the friction that occurs when you try to mix together disciplines. Like people in mathematics are very much about, my subject is the best, mathematics governs everything, and that's the only important thing. People in the arts and literature, they don't know anything about mathematics usually, and they think that what they're doing is the most important. This is something that C.P. Snow wrote in a famous essay almost, about 80 years ago, called The 2 Cultures. And he talked about how way back then in England, people in these 2 fields, the science fields and the humanities and arts fields, they didn't have any dialogue between them. And since then, this is a problem that in some sense has even grown worse. I think in today's society, you really have to have both things, in the sense that, to make sense about what's happening, all the figures and statistics that are being thrown at you by politicians or whoever, you need some sort of numerical sense. So that's something that's quite hard to actually just gain, and you need some sort of mathematical training or intuition for that. On the other hand, people in the humanities, the people in the sciences often don't have that same vocal ability, the same ability to communicate, which people in the humanities do. And in the US especially, what they've been trying to do is combine these 2. They've come up with an acronym called STEAM. So S stands for science, T stands for technology, E stands for engineering, M stands for mathematics. That makes STEM. And these are the fields that are all the technical fields. But now they've added an A for arts into that. And they feel that with this A for arts, you can really get these 2 halves together and get students and people and adults to really accept these technical things much more easily. So that's where our play was headed. And so what happened after that was that we actually performed the play in several cities in the US. We went to Texas, we went to New York City, we went to Washington, D.C., and we're actually going to be doing it in a few other places. But the really interesting thing is that in India, I did an excerpt of it in Mumbai, and then in Delhi, there was a production company led by Kuljit Singh, who has his own production company called Atelier Productions. And through the American Center, they actually did a full-fledged production. So they had costumes and lighting and music and everything. So they really brought it to life. And so just a few days ago, I was actually lucky enough to sit in the audience and see my own play for the first time, just because I've always been acting in it. And it was just a great experience. And so we had 2 shows, they were both full. So I hope they'll do a few more because several people couldn't get in. It's also being produced in Pittsburgh by an entirely different team, again a full production. So I'm hoping that, especially in university environments and in general environments, that this idea will catch on, just because it gets people to think, after all, we are all human beings and we all have these two sides to us. What is the synthesis between them? So in the play there's a lot of fighting between these two sides, but then it's the students who actually manage to get these things two together by what they do is they do a mathematical version of Shakespeare. So it's kind of funny, and the Delhi production was great. They had some sort of rap music playing, and it was really, you have to see it to see how they did it. But so I'm very encouraged by that. So that's been my latest kind of thing. After writing my trilogy of 3 books, Death of Vishnu, Age of Shiva, City of Devi, I've moved away to try and combine my two things of being a mathematician and being a writer, and try to amalgamate those two together. And I'll also tell you that the next book that I'm writing is another novel. It's called The Godfather of Numbers. And as you can suspect, it has numbers in it. It has mathematics in it. But again, it's aimed at people who are non-mathematicians. So I'm still a few years away from that. So maybe the next time I talk to you, I'll be talking about that instead. So what happens in the play is that these two professors are actually forced by their university to teach this class together, and they really don't want to. And throughout the class, the woman professor, the English professor, she tries to keep introducing poetry and Shakespeare and so on. She decides she wants to do King Lear. And the mathematician is trying to impose mathematics. So he's talking about calculus and limits and zero and so on. And the whole play talks about how they actually managed to find some common ground. I'll give you an example. For example, King Lear is a famous play. It's probably Shakespeare's most famous tragedy. And one of the things that happens in the play is that Shakespeare uses the word nothing about 29 times in the play. And there's a famous saying, nothing will come of nothing. Now, why did he use it 29 times in that play and not other plays? Well, if you start looking into the history behind that, it turns out the number 0 was just being introduced into Europe at that time. So this was probably a reaction to the fact that, the numerals that we know as the Arabic numerals were just coming into common usage, especially 0. And so that is what we looked into, looked at the historical underpinnings of some of these things. Another example is that there are several poems that deal with mathematics, and they talk about the beauty of mathematics. So we were trying to bring that to the audience, like giving them little flashes of how mathematics occurs in nature or in literature or in poetry, and really connecting the two. Now that's not an easy thing to do. In the play, if you don't know mathematics, I think what you will see are little flashes of it, and that hopefully will get your curiosity aroused. And so people have told me, hey, I didn't know what fractals mean, but I went home and looked at it on the internet, and now I know more about it. What happens in the play, though, is that the two professors, they are so ego-driven that they are unable to communicate the synthesis to the class. And it's left to the students. The students have to come up with a final project. And it's the students who show the professors how these two things can be combined. So they actually go back to King Lear and they look at even more mathematical meaning in some of the events that occur in the play, and also fictionalize it. So that's where that amalgam, that's where the synthesis comes. And so the final scene is about what the professors finally learn from the students. There's this old saying about teachers actually learning from their students, and that's an illustration of what happens. One of the things that we do explore is there's a whole movement called Olipo, that's O-U-L-I-P-O, and this was a French movement that was started in the 1960s, and it was a group of people who are poets, but also some of them are mathematicians. What they did was they came up with strict mathematical constraints on all their work, and they said that, okay, we are only going to do, we are going to create a poem that is going to have these characteristics. And their idea was that by putting these mathematical constraints, that actually unleashes creativity, that makes you more creative. You know, if you're told, okay, write a poem on any topic, it's very hard to do that. But if you're told, okay, write a poem where, let's say, every third word has a certain pattern, or everything else has, follows something else, then it becomes a much harder problem, and certain other muscles in your mind are activated. And so that's one of the things we looked at in this play, how some of these things actually translate. And this movement is still very much alive, and people are still, there are several people who you can find compendiums of their work. So that's one more example. Not in the play, we don't talk about haikus as such, but we do, there are rules called N+7, for example. So that's something, an Olipian rule where talking about haikus, there's something called the snowball. And the way that works is the first line of the poem has one word, then two words, then three words, then four words. And you have to worry also about the number of syllables. So that's very haiku-ish in the same sense. So that's one example, but you can make up your own rules as well. That's part of the fun. So one of the projects we had was for students to make up their own rules. Yes, so the play is more, is not, there's two things here. One is the class that we actually taught, and the play is really a fictionalized version of that. So we are not trying to teach you mathematics or have you do these rules. We're actually trying to get to the human part. Plays are best, drama is best when you're trying to probe into what makes us human. So the play is called The Mathematics of Being Human. And so what we're really looking at is this clash of cultures and whether there is any common ground. So that's the essential part. Yeah, so the class had all these examples. The students were all non-mathematicians, so they were actually quite horrified when they learned that this compulsory course that they had to take, they were all scholarship people in the humanities, and suddenly they had to do this mathematics class. So we made it clear that we aren't going to teach them mathematics. We're really looking at the philosophy of mathematics, its intersection with our day-to-day life, and how it reacts with the humanities. And some of it, there's this whole area called digital humanities, which has become very popular now, where you're using technical techniques to actually bring humanities to the forefront, make it more understandable to people, do more analysis. For example, one of the things you've probably heard about is word analysis. You can analyze words, the way sentence structure is constructed and word usage is constructed, to see if it fits a pattern that a certain author might have. So this has been used, for instance, to check whether a given work is by William Shakespeare or not, if it fits the pattern. You can also do this with images. You can break up images into something called wavelets, and you can get a fingerprint of any painter. So you could also analyze a painting and see whether that actually fits the fingerprint of a painter and see whether that's a true painting. So we looked at some of these things.